working at research sites has got more and more complex. Clinical trial protocols have got more sophisticated, which places demand on the site, yes, but also on the patient. The knock-on effect is now you've got to manage the technology burden. Very often what it's doing is adding inefficiency to the system.
What can we do better? Welcome to the SCDM podcast series on partnership in clinical trials. My pleasure to have you here. So maybe for the audience, Paul, do you mind introducing yourself and your background?
Sure. I'm Paul Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of Velocity Clinical Research. Velocity is a 90-plus site, own clinical research site model operating in 4 countries, the US, Germany, Poland, and the United Kingdom. And as far as background goes, I started running research sites longer than I'd care to admit, but it was more than 30 years ago in Europe, and ran research sites for about 13 years and then switched to the CRO industry for another 13 years, still focusing on sites, but now managing sites, not actually running them. And then I came back to Velocity and moved to the United States 6 years ago. So that's a brief history a quick canter through my CV.
Now, could you bring a totally unique perspective, having been both on the site side and the CRO side? And I think we want to get your insight really on what we can do to improve patients' inclusion in clinical trial while overburdening the sites. And I think to me, it's an important topic. You often think about the site ourselves, but we never ask the sites and the patient what they think. So maybe what feedback do you have for us on maybe technologies or complex protocol? What can we do better?
Well, one of the interesting things about my 30 years in the industry is that working at research sites has got more and more complex. Clinical trial protocols have got more sophisticated, which places demand on the site, yes, but also on the patient. Lots of drivers behind that. A lot of them are financial. A lot of them are about trying to get more benefit out of fewer protocols. And why not? We're giving experimental drugs to patients. You always want to minimize the number of patients that you need, the amount of time they need to spend in the trial, and so on. But there's no doubt that over the years, we've seen a huge increase in complexity. And technology is behind a lot of that. And, at the site level, that can be quite demanding. Just the number of systems we have to use these days. In one of my sites, it happened to be my CTO, because we wanted him to see what was going on at a site. Visited a site, went and shadowed a coordinator for one visit, one trial, and she touched 20 different systems. Somebody actually asked me yesterday how many of those were our systems. The answer was 2. The other 18 came from the sponsor or the CRO. So there's a huge amount of effort to get to competent with that technology, huge training burden in the first place. And of course, that's one study. Every sponsor uses different technology. Even within a single sponsor, you'll get different project teams will use different technologies.
Absolutely.
So it's a constant burden to stay on top of all the different technologies that we're being asked to use. And that's only increased over the last whatever years.
And I would suspect some of those technologies are also being used by the patients, right?
Yeah, and the eCOA technologies that we use now to collect data from patients at home, which are, it's the law of unintended consequences. They're introduced to make collecting that data easier and more straightforward, and to make the patient's life simpler. The knock-on effect is now you've got to manage the technology burden. And I do think sometimes we underestimate, particularly, and this is no disrespect to the bright people in technology companies that develop this technology, but they are technology competent. Then there are people like me in the world that's only competent with technology while my children are around me. And then, when they're not there, I'm incompetent. And so for patients, they may or may not be comfortable with that, the level of technology that we're giving them. But what we find at the site is, regardless of what the intention is and what the support is, the first line help desk for any patient is always going to be the coordinator or the PI, mostly the coordinator, because that's who they have a relationship with. And of course, a lot of companies put good help desks in place, but those patients don't know those companies. These are company names they've never heard of. They don't even know where that help desk is. So the natural person for them to call up is the research coordinator. And so they may not be the best people to handle that. I mean, my experience is that most people who are working in healthcare generally tend to want to be focused on patients, not using technology and so on. So having worked in large, sophisticated CROs, the two I did work in were two of the largest in the world. You know, everybody gets comfortable with technology. You have to, it's the way you work. At the site level, that's much less so.
Absolutely.
So these are not, without denigrating them in any way, these are not the most tech-savvy staff in any company you're ever going to come across. Very often also, the nature of research sites, particularly those that might be hospital-based and so on, is that the infrastructure they're using may not actually be that advanced. You know, they could be using old computers. You know, I've been in many research sites where they're still using desktops, you know, for example. So you're putting the burden, unintentionally in many ways, but putting the burden on the least able and capable people to provide this tech support. Not intended, but it's the way it works out.
No, absolutely. And we have heard many times that sites believe that site coordinator spend at times more time on system than time with patients. Do you have an idea of how much time they would spend maybe on system versus patients and the impact on them?
I haven't collected the data, absolutely, but I would certainly reinforce that point, that they're spending more time in systems than they are with patients. So that's driving down the number of patient visits we can do and the number of patients we can enroll into clinical trials. So in fact, you know, clinical trials are often slow to enroll, and the amount of work you have to do outside of the patient visit is driving some of that. So the idea that all of this technology is making the process more efficient, actually I think is a misnomer. Very often what it's doing is adding inefficiency to the system. What it is doing, in my view, of course, is shortening the route from the site to the sponsor, to the database, and to the sponsor. So it's certainly doing that. It's all designed, this is from our perception sitting at sites, it's all designed, of course, to help the back office function of the sponsor company. It's not actually helping the site. It's something we have to deal with. It's our job, but it's not doing anything to make our life any easier in the main.
And to be honest, your experience is not different from what we're observing from our sites as well. One of your sites told us, like you, they're using more than 20 systems. In addition, they may be using data collection technologies, wearable, on top of it. And they even claimed that their coordinator was spending more than half of their time with technology, but the time was not with patients at all. So what you say is really resonating very well with what we are being told as well.
And if you'd asked me, like I said, we haven't measured it, but if you asked me to put a number on it, I would have said, yes, we spend more than half our time outside of the patient contact time. So, which, as I say, the negative impact of that is
absolutely
potentially either fewer patients in the clinical trials, or in some ways, the time of the trial spins out because it takes longer to do, which is kind of perverse because the whole point of the technology should be to improve efficiency. It isn't necessarily doing that.
No, absolutely. Now, if we pivot to the patient side, is there any advice you have for the audience about what we can do to reduce the burden on patients from your site perspective?
Well, again, we're back to the technology, I'm afraid, which is don't assume that everybody is comfortable with the technology, particularly since, you know, clinical trial patients skew older. That's the nature of chronic disease. It becomes more impactful as you get older. That's not to say that people aren't comfortable with technology just because they're getting over 60. I've put myself in that category. But it does mean they don't necessarily want to have to deal with this. Most people that take part in clinical trials, most patients take part in clinical trials, are actually very happy to be at the site and having time from the physician and the coordinators. You don't necessarily have to take all the technology, take all of the trial away from the site so that it can be done in the patient's home. Sometimes there's very good reason to do that. But it doesn't have to be that way because patients are actually very comfortable to come and visit research sites.
And maybe another question, do you think we listen enough to the patients on what they really want and how they want to participate in clinical trial?
I don't think anybody does that fundamentally, whether you're a research site. So I'm not putting this on the sponsors. And of course, there is a barrier there, which is for sponsor companies, CROs, there's the whole privacy angle and not knowing who the patient is in their particular trials. So to speak to patients while they're on trials from a sponsor's perspective is very, very difficult. I understand that. And afterwards, maybe the patient no longer wants to come back or whatever. But even at the site level, I put that back on us and say, we probably don't spend enough time surveying our patients and asking them, what was your experience? Our perception was you were happy with this, you were unhappy with that. But that's only our perception. It's not the patient's perception. So I don't think any of us spend enough time surveying the patients themselves and getting their direct feedback on what the trial experience was like. Interestingly, when I worked on the CRO side of the fence, I spent a lot of time surveying the sites to get feedback as to what we had done, how we'd done it, what their experience had been. And it was extremely helpful, but we never asked the patient. And in this industry as a whole, we have a tendency when we want to know what patients think, we ask the physician.
Absolutely.
And that's beneficial. I wouldn't rubbish that at all. But if you really want to know what a patient thinks, ask the patient.
No, absolutely. As we conclude the podcast, Paul, is there anything you would like to ask from the industry that could help sites and patients? Any wishful thinking?
Wishful thinking. I think the big thing for us, going back to the amount of technology we use, is can you please simplify this? Interoperability would make our life a lot easier. We haven't even touched in this podcast on, passwords. If you're doing a lot of clinical trials, the number of passwords that everyone supposedly memorizes, we know they don't. But so using different passwords between systems, that would make life a lot easier for everybody. That's a very simple thing right there. When I think about, the end of last century and EDC started to roll out, there was a time when we might have used 20 or 30 EDC systems. And eventually that really became 3 dominant ones. Took a little bit of time, but that's where we got to. So I think, what I'd really ask people is make it as easy as possible for us to use the technology. We know that can be done because in consumer systems, they're very easy. They have to be, right? If you're developing technology for Amazon and it's not simple to use, people don't use it. Therefore, you don't get sales. Therefore, you're not commercially successful. So we know that we can make using technology easier all around. So that would be my first ask. If you could just do away with half the passwords we have to use, that would everybody would say that would be great. The second thing I'd ask people is, can you think about why you need this particular technology for this clinical trial? Why is this a new one? We've used similar systems in previous studies, and now you've inflicted a new one on us. It's too much to ask that every sponsor uses the same technology. I get that. But even within a single sponsor, if we could use the same technology all the time, that would be nice. So I think, not using new technology just because it's new, just because it's a bright, shiny toy. And then the other thing I'd ask of sponsors is, really think about whether that technology is ready for prime time. There are, and I'm here with you at SCDM, there's a hall upstairs full of exhibitors with bright, shiny technology. Sometimes that's not all ready to be used in the real world. So that would be my other request to them. Really make sure this is robust. If we never needed the help desk, wouldn't that be great? But when you call in the help desk all the time because it's just not working the way it was meant to work or designed to work. And I have a technology group of my own in India, and very often they'll present me with things which all of those smart technology people there in India can use flawlessly. Then they give it to me and it's like, what? And I start doing stupid things with the technology that they'd never dreamt anybody would be that stupid, right? But we are. So I think that would be my other ask is, can you really make sure this technology is ready for prime time when you roll it out?
Okay. One more question to you is, protocol are becoming more.
Well, as part of this, protocols have become more complicated. I mean, we have the metrics. I always used to quote that in any given phase 3 study, we'd collect about 1.5 million data points. My understanding now it's more like 3.5 million data points. Now that's a reflection of we're trying to do more with a single protocol. But my real question to the industry is, are you using that data?
That's a fair question.
And are you, or are you, when you sit down and you plan the protocol, doing things because you can? So again, I think my ask of people would be, if you're in a protocol development meeting and somebody says, wouldn't it be cool to collect data on, before they even finish the sentence, the answer is no. Because at that point, that's a nice to have. Do we really need that? What is it we have to know from this study? And I know that's a gray area at the margins. But when you've gone to 3.5 million data points in your average phase 3 study, we're collecting too much data because the technology makes it easy for us to.
Absolutely.
But to what end? What purpose? And very often people think, well, I do hear this back from, statisticians in the industry, which is, we certainly can't collect the data after the study's ended. I get that. So we'll collect it because we might need to refer back to it. But really, critically, how many times do you go back to that data that's sitting on the shelf gathering dust, so to speak, and you never ever use it? So I do think that as an industry, there's an obligation on us to think seriously about, why are we collecting this data? What are we really going to use it for? And if we started to strip some of those things back, it would be to everybody's benefit. All of this ultimately costs money. And when you make clinical trials more complex, they're more expensive to run. The problem with that is it's a zero-sum game. At the end of the day, we're developing drugs to put in the hands of patients who need them. So if we could make clinical trials more efficient, cost less, that's not about profit margins for pharmaceutical companies. That's actually about them being able to do more research and put more drugs into the hands of patients. So I think we're all obliged to figure out how to do what we do more cost effectively.
And to me, that's a kind of agree more, Paul.
Good. Thank you.